Well, today I'm with Mark Wilkie again for another uh, Bamboo and Biltong episode. And why today is interesting, it's the 8th of December, which is when the whole war in the Pacific against the Japanese kicked off. Actually, it was on this day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, although because of the dateline crossing and because Hawaii is on a different time zone to us, in Hawaii time, it happened on the 7th of December, and on the 8th of December in the evening, the Americans declared war against Japan. And but it was in the early hours of the morning of the 8th of December, which is today, that the war in the Pacific kicked off in Malaya and the Philippines. And Mark Wilkie is here to tell us all about that. He's the expert on these things. And so, Mark, thank you for joining us today. Over to you, brother.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. I'm going to start sharing the screen. It's got host. Okay. Remembering the outbreak of the Pacific War on the 8th of December. So, kind of following on from something that we did last month here in Taiwan for the Remembrance Weekend, we did 1,000 kilometers and 5 memorials. We decided to do something today at the Kobe Airfield. So Kobe Airfield was an Imperial Japanese naval airfield. It was established in 1939, and it's located in Hue, Yunlin County, which is about 10 kilometers or so from where I live. Okay, I'm going to go through and I'll start. I've got a bit of a timeline here. I've rounded off everything to what would be Malayan time at that point, and they were using 7.5 hours ahead of GMT. So at 1 a.m., the Japanese amphibious landing occurs at Kota Baru in northern British Malaya. And that's the start of the Pacific War, where they come ashore in northern Malaya. Um, the attack had been planned and actually launched from Taiwan, and they'd sailed across and stopped in Hainan, and then moved along to to land in Kota Baru at 2:15 a.m. That would be Hawaiian time, about 7:45 a.m. on the 7th of December. There was, as you said, they're the other side of the date line. They attacked the Pearl Harbor naval base. Then at 4 a.m., quite a lot of things happen. First is there's the on the late afternoon of the 7th, in that's working Malayan time, the Japanese had sent the Thais an ultimatum to cooperate with them. And by the early hours of the morning, the Thais hadn't responded yet. And the Japanese landed in Thailand, 2 beaches in Thailand, and also Japanese troops that were based in French Indochina, which would be Vietnam, crossed over the border and invaded Thailand. There was a bit of fighting there. Also, at around 4 a.m., the Japanese bombed Singapore. They also launched an attack on the international settlement in Shanghai in China. At 5 a.m., they bombed the U.S. territory of Wake Island. 5:30 a.m., they bombed the U.S. territory of Guam. At about 7 a.m., they began an assault on the British colony of Hong Kong. Then at about 8:45, now this had been planned to take place considerably earlier, but there was unseasonal fog all over southern Taiwan, and this delayed the attack on the Philippines by several hours. So at 8:45 a.m., the fog had finally lifted, and all the Japanese squadrons in southern Taiwan were able to take off, and they formed up at 8:45 to go fly across to the Philippines and attack the airfields there. And at 12:45, they attacked Clark Airfield, which was the main US base on Luzon, and caught more than half of the US aircraft on the ground and wiped them out. So basically in a single raid, they took out more than half of the American aircraft in the Philippines. Others kind of fled down to Mindanao. And this is just to show where Kota Bharu is. It's marked there on the Malayan Peninsula. Just to locate yourself, you can see the map there showing what Japan controlled in 1941. You see the main Japanese islands, and then Korea and Formosa or Taiwan were Japanese colonies. And they controlled Manchuria or Manchukuo, as they called it, and basically Indochina. All right, so they launched the attack at 1 a.m. on Kota Bharu. And when we think about the Pacific War, I think very often we think of the Americans, we think of Pearl Harbor, we have images of burning ships, and then we kind of think of the British in Singapore and Malaya, and maybe the Australians. But there were some South Africans there. And these are some of the South African connections that I've been able to establish, where South Africans were involved on that day, on the 8th of December. Actually, it's Southern Africans. I've included Rhodesians as well. And this is not to say that these people were out and out South Africans. Some of them were. They were, born in South Africa, grown up in South Africa, regarded themselves as South Africans. Others, it was more they were born in South Africa and they might have grown up elsewhere. So I'm not making an outright claim that these people were South Africans, but these were people that were born in South Africa, and some were certainly, regarded themselves as South Africans. Okay, the very first troops to go into action on the 8th of December at Kota Bharu were the 8th Indian Infantry Brigade, and they were under Brigadier Billy Key. Now, Billy Key was born in the Free State in 1895. So the commander of the first troops in action on that day was South African born. Billy Key's troops fought well, and eventually they were overpowered and pushed back. But Billy Key kind of kept his reputation intact, and in January 1942, he was actually promoted to Major General, and he became the officer commanding the 11th Indian Division. He was captured in Singapore on the 15th of February, and in August 1942, he was shipped to Taiwan. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony since 1895, and it was deep inside the Japanese Empire. Also, Taiwan has got the highest mountains in Asia east of the Himalayas. Now, Taiwan's a small island, and it's got over 200 mountains higher than 3,000 meters. The highest point is 3,952 meters. So it's a very difficult island to try and attack. And so the Japanese made a decision to move their most valuable POWs for safekeeping Taiwan. So all the generals and basically all the officers, colonel and above, were sent to Taiwan. The civilian governors of colonies were sent to Taiwan, and also very skilled technical captured POWs were also sent to Taiwan. So Billy Key was sent to Taiwan. He was held in Korenko, and which was the main senior officers' camp for Taiwan, and another camp called Tamazato. Tamazato was just an eye blind for the Red Cross. The camp only existed for about 6 weeks, and they established this perfect model camp and put all the generals in it, brought in the Red Cross. They had a look. As soon as the Red Cross was gone, they closed the camp and sent them back to Korenko. Then later he was sent to Shirakawa, which is a camp on the border of Chiayi and Tainan. Shirakawa is probably about 30 kilometers from where I live. Then in October 44, he was transferred to Manchuria. He was liberated there on the 19th of August, 1945. At the end of the war, he becomes the aide-de-camp to George VI, and then he goes back to India, and he has a few commands there. He retired in 1949. He died in Kent in England in 1986. The other person that was there was Captain Wyndham Ford. Forbes. He was born in 1909 in Frankfurt in the Orange Free State, and he was the adjutant of the 5th Field Regiment Royal Artillery. Um, he left South Africa as a young child. His father was a doctor, and they went to Kenya, and he spent most of his life in Kenya. He was a chartered accountant, and he was working in India when the war broke out, and he went into the Royal Artillery. He was taken POW in Singapore as well, and in November 1942, he was shipped to Taiwan, and he was held in Tahoku number 6 camp, and then later Shirakawa. He survived the war and was liberated in September 1945. He returned to Kenya and became president of the East African Association of Chartered Accountants, and was a very successful. He actually went into politics as well, and he retired to the Isle of Man in the 1970s. His wife was from the Isle of Man, and he died in 2008. One other person I've got that was there was Gunner Colin Simpson, who was born in 1919, Allowal North in the Cape Province, and he was in the 88th Field Regiment. Um, he was also taken POW in Singapore, and then he was transported to Thailand, and he worked on the Death Railway. He survived it, and he was liberated on the 20th September 1945. Then, moving down the Malayan Peninsula, at 4 a.m., we have the bombing of Singapore. Obviously, that resulted in casualties. And Major Dr. Philip Bloom, who was born in Durban in 1903 and did his medical degree in South Africa, he was a major in the Royal Army Medical Corps. And he was in charge of casualty receiving at Roberts General Hospital. And so he was obviously working that morning, as he did throughout the campaign, with the wounded. There were 3 other South African doctors serving in the Royal Army Medical Corps, all present in Singapore, and they also would have all been working on the 8th of December. Then Ruva attacked over to Hong Kong at 7 a.m. In Hong Kong, we have Gunner Darcy Arthur Baker Carr, who was born in Johannesburg in 1908. He was a Hong Kong-based businessman, and he was the son of Brigadier General Baker Carr. He was doing frequent travels to the USA. He'd married a Canadian called Catherine McBurney in Peking in 1934. She passed away in 1937. As tensions had grown in Hong Kong with the threat of an invasion by Japan, he had joined the 2nd Battery of the Hong Kong Artillery, Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Force Artillery, and he was taken POW in Hong Kong on Christmas Day in 1941. He was then transported to Japan in January 44, and he was held in Nagoya and Osaka camps. He was liberated there in September 45. He was a prominent collector of Chinese art, and he died in 1985 in Mashonaland East in Zimbabwe. Gunner Norman Hugh Mackenzie, who was born in Salisbury in southern Rhodesia in 1915. He was a university lecturer in Hong Kong, and when the threat of military invasion grew, he joined the 1st Battery of the Hong Kong Artillery, Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Force. He also was taken POW on Christmas Day of 1941. He was transported to Japan in March of 1943 and held in various camps there, liberated in September 1945. He went on to be a prominent English and drama professor at University College of Rhodesia from 1955 to 1965. And then he left and went to Queen's University in Canada and was at Queen's from 1966 to 1980. And he died in 2004 in Ontario, Canada. There was also a Private Charles Mason, who was born in Natal in 1916, and he had joined the 3rd Infantry Company of the Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps. He was also captured on Christmas Day 41. He worked as an electrician, and he was also transported to Japan in 1943, and he was liberated from there September 1945. Then there was Lieutenant James Douglas Clegg. He was born in Bulawayo in southern Rhodesia in 1917. He had joined the British Army, and he was in the Royal Artillery in the 5th Anti-Aircraft Regiment. and he had been sent out to Hong Kong. He was also taken POW in 1941. And in April of 1942, he managed to escape and he got into China and he joined up with Chinese forces. He eventually got back to Allied lines and he was promptly promoted to major and he was sent back into China to assist the Chinese guerrilla forces and also establish I guess, a communication repatriation line for Allied POW escapees in China. He then was able to get into Thailand towards the end of the war, and he negotiates the Japanese surrender and takes the Japanese surrender in Bangkok. He finishes the war as a colonel, and after the war, he becomes a very prominent businessman in Hong Kong. And he is credited with the man behind the Hong Kong tunnels, road tunnels under the harbour. He was knighted in the early 1970s, and he died in England in 1981. There were also 5 civilian internees held by the Japanese in Hong Kong, 2 women, 2 children, and 1 male. I'll get back onto the Kobe Airfield. So it's clear that there was some South African involvement. And obviously, as the weeks progressed, more and more Southern Africans got sucked into it. And I mean, ultimately, the South African Navy would experience their greatest losses, not against the Germans, but against the Japanese. This is a map of the Japanese Empire in June 1942. And you can see Formosa or Taiwan almost right in the middle there. And Kobe Airfield is obviously on Taiwan. Now, Taiwan was a very strategic location for the Japanese because between the main islands of the home islands of Japan and Taiwan are the Ryukyu Islands, which are also Japanese. And in the middle of the Ryukyus is Okinawa. So Taiwan was basically the southern gateway to Japan. And it was very much a hub for the Japanese military. And as it turned out that the before the Philippines could be invaded and before the war could, before they could move on and take Iwo Jima and Okinawa and things, they had to break the might of Japan's air power, land-based air power, and that was in Formosa or Taiwan. So Taiwan is basically the key to Japanese land-based air defenses. And in the middle of that is Kobe Airfield. So in 1895, Taiwan becomes Japan's first colony. In 1939, Kobe Naval Airfield is established during the Sino-Japanese War. In 1941, it becomes a secondary airfield under the Tainan Squadron Group. Now, what's important about the Tainan Squadron Group is that that squadron produces more Japanese air aces than any other squadron. And Kobe is directly connected to that squadron. In 1942, in the early part of 43, the Kobe Airfield is expanded significantly. And in 1943, it becomes the primary pilot training airfield on Taiwan. And it continues this way until 1945. In January to August 1945, the Americans start literally pounding Taiwan every single day. And the Japanese were using sugar, because Taiwan's a major producer of sugar. And Hue or Kobe was right smack bang in the heart of Taiwan's sugar industry. And the Japanese were making butanol from sugar, and they were converting this into aviation fuel for their aircraft. So the sugar factories became a huge target for the Allies. The airfield is situated only about 2 kilometers from the sugar refinery. And so it was a frequent target for the Allies. In February, things are not going well for the Japanese. and Kobe Airfield becomes a kamikaze base. And typically the kamikazes were trained there, and then they were sent up to an airfield in Yilan in northeastern Taiwan, and from there they would make their attacks on Allied shipping. Now, a number of kamikazes from Kobe were sent up to Yilan and then to bases in the Ryukyu Islands to attack shipping. And that would have been during the Battle of Okinawa. But if you look at the islands that they went to, and also some of them were land based from Yilan, they were not attacking the Americans, they were attacking the British Pacific Fleet. And in the British Pacific Fleet, in the Battle of Okinawa or Operation Iceberg, there were at least 100 South African naval personnel taking part in that battle, including Fleet Air Arm pilots. And so it is conceivable that that some of these kamikaze from Kobe Airfield actually came up against um, South Africans. The reason I say that is that the greatest Hellcat ace of Commonwealth ace of World War II, Edward Wilson, was a South African, and he was very much engaged in dogfighting and things like that during that campaign. So it is conceivable. All right, then eventually Japan surrenders in August of 45. Then the nationalist Chinese come into Taiwan, and in March, or actually the end of February 1947, there's an uprising in Taiwan. And in March 1947, Taiwanese militia, basically from Doleo, where I live, go and attack the nationalist Chinese troops in the airfield. And there's a battle there for 2 days. And eventually the militia overpower them and take over the airfield. But while this is happening, Chiang Kai-shek is bringing his loads of reinforcements over from China, and he trucks down several battalions, and they get down to where Kobe is, and the Taiwanese militia has got no chance against organized battalions of Chinese troops, and there's a dreadful massacre there, and so it's a very sad chapter in Taiwanese history. After that, the Air Force here uses it as a training base, and it remained as a training base for the Air Force until 1994. This morning, Glenn de Villiers, who's also a member of our South African Defence Force Association group, the same as you are, John, and we went out to the Kobe Airfield, and we laid a wreath in memory of the Southern African born that were caught up in the Pacific War. So if we look at it, there was Group Captain Rice died at Shirakawa, who was from Cape Town. That was only 30 kilometers from there. There were a number of South Africans that lost their lives around here, and we wanted to remember them. This is the water tower at the Kobe Airfield. During the war, there was a machine gun emplacement and a lookout on top of the tower. The tower is reinforced. You can actually see the impact marks from 50 calibers from the strafing. That would be from P-51s and Hellcats, would have been in 1945. You can see them clearly on the masonry of the building there. Many of the bunkers from the airfield still survive. These were a few pictures of the bunkers. There's still some ruined buildings. That's another bunker over there, and a few wartime photos. It's a Japanese aircraft airfield. This was taken actually down in Papua New Guinea in about June of 1942. This is these are pilots of the Tainan fighter squadron, and they had just been transferred from Taiwan down to Papua New Guinea, and so many of these pilots had been in Kobe. These are a few photographs of set late in the war. These are kamikaze trainees in 1945 in Kobe. It's when you get to the kamikaze, it's a very sad. There's a great sadness attached to it. There's, on the one hand, they wreak such terrible destruction and it's insane, but the other hand, many of these youngsters are almost forced into it. They're almost like shamed into it, and they. I've read a few uh, documents related to the kamikaze at Kobe, and most of them were like youngsters, kind of 17, 18. And several of them luckily survived the war in the sense that they hadn't been sent out before the war ended. And they spoke of it as being almost a utopian existence where the locals were very pleasant to them. There was, because it was a farming community, there was still good food to be had. There were kids and things like that around, and they were kind of largely left alone to their own devices, except they had to do a bit of training. And many of them kind of spoke of, apart from the air raids, they almost they felt it was the happiest time of the war for them, because they, in some ways, they kind of experienced almost this freedom that they hadn't experienced in that rigid Japanese system before. But obviously, some of them didn't make it, others did. Those that did left very fond memories of Kobe Airfield. These are just a few pictures of some of the kamikaze trainees. These are a few wartime photos of the airfield being attacked. There's also quite a strange incident, and some of the pockmarks on the water tower might well actually have originated from this attack. On the 4th of January 1945, Lieutenant Charles August, US Navy, is involved in an attack on the airfield. They come in, it's a group of Hellcats and Avengers, and they come in, and the Avengers drop their bombs, and the Hellcats are strafing. And they do their first strafing run, and then they reform about 10 kilometers from the airfield and return for a second run at the airfield. And while August is engaged in his second run, suddenly his engine just seizes, and he's really low. And the only thing he can do is crash land in one of the rice paddies next to the airfield. And he does that. And because he's low at the rice paddy in January, that's our dry season. I guess it's, the aircraft came down literally intact, and he was captured. In the photos at the bottom, you can see the Hellcat in the rice paddy. The second picture shows August being led away into captivity. He was then shipped off to Japan, and the Hellcat was repaired, flown to Japan, and used by the Japanese, and was painted with Japanese, as the same as other Japanese aircraft. And the final photo is a picture of the captured Hellcat with its Japanese markings at the end of the war. Now, what's interesting about August is he was quite a pilot. He had won the Silver Star, which is the second highest medal for valor in the American forces, and he had also received a Distinguished Flying Cross. but he had the disposition of being the only American pilot in World War II to be taken POW twice. Um, he was first shot down and taken POW in Operation Torch in Tunisia, and he was then held by the Vichy French. And after that regime collapsed, he was released. He flew in Europe, and then he was sent to the Far East. And he flew in, was over Taiwan that he went down for the second time and was captured. Um, he was sent to Japan to the Mori POW camp. And the Mori POW camp in Japan is the camp where Captain Louis Zamperini, B-24 pilot and an Olympiad distance runner, was being held. You might have heard of him in that there was quite a well-known book and movie called Unbroken that came out about him. Now, in the Amori camp was one of the most evil of the Japanese POW guards, who was nicknamed the Bird. Uh, his real name was Muchiro Watanabe, and he was at Amori. So August also came up against Amori, but also in that camp where these two were, there was a Lieutenant Lambert Rees, Royal Engineers, who was from Pretoria. Rees had been captured in Singapore and then transferred to Hato camp in southern Taiwan and then sent on to Amori camp in Japan. So in a small roundabout way, we have a connection to a South African through Charles August because they land up in the same camp towards the end of the war in Japan together. So I think that basically shows um, that even though the 8th of August is not really seen as a Southern African thing, there were South Africans involved right from the beginning.
8th of
And
December.
8th of December, yeah. And throughout the war, as with POWs, there were a couple of hundred South Africans, both military and civilian internees, that landed up in Japanese POW camps. Over 2,000 South African sailors, South African Navy, served in support of the Burma campaign, and another more than 400 served in the Pacific. We also had a number of SAP pilots, seconded to the RAF that was serving in Burma and India during the war. So there certainly are a number of South Africans that were involved in this, and they're not, nobody really remembers them. And I think, because we're out here, it's important that we do remember that some of our own people were involved in this.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Also of interest, Shirakawa in Japanese means White River.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, I will include just now some photographs of the War Museum here in Valencia, where I live in the Philippines. There's an interesting war museum, and it's of all the weapons and things that have been found in this area. And so, just like Taiwan, we were also colonized, if you like, by the Japanese, occupied by the Japanese during World War II. Near where my girlfriend lives is a beautiful metal bridge across one of the rivers that was built by the Japanese and is still very serviceable and in use every single day, and has survived all kinds of typhoons and floods, everything else. The Japanese are very good at building things like bridges. Yeah.
I think around here, we have a number of Japanese bridges around here, metal ones, and I imagine that they're probably very similar to the one that you've got there. Yeah. Another interesting thing, we were speaking to the guy that's kind of the curator of the site, and he was telling us that last week they dug up 6 ceramic Japanese hand grenades.
Wow.
And he was saying that towards the end of the war, because of the shortages of metal, the Japanese started producing large quantities of ceramic hand grenades, and they
I heard that.
And and they'd unearthed 6 of them last week while they were digging around. Yeah,
Goodness me. Yeah, I believe they had ceramic landmines as well.
yeah,
And some of the treasure sites here where the all the stolen gold and everything was sent to the Philippines by General Yamashita. A lot of the treasure sites are booby trapped still. And a lot of the explosives are encased in ceramic.
okay.
Of the old World War II booby traps, where the gold treasure is buried. Yeah. Mark, is that it? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
Great.
John.
All right,
Okay.
my brother.
Take care.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye bye.